Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about the difference between lateralizations and regressions and the appropriate time for each of them. So if you look here, before we dive into all the slides, I want to really show you guys the picture so you have the image in your mind, and then we'll go through and show video demonstrations of everything so it clicks a little bit more. And then at the end, I'll show this slide again, and then everything should make the most sense and really come together. So if we start at the top left with the conventional deadlift, and then you move down to the hex bar deadlift, then the double dumbbell deadlift, then the kettlebell deadlift, and then the PVC hinge, that is what we consider a regression. So if we start with the top left and you move down, those are examples of regression. So think about each of those blue boxes as different levels. There are some things that we can do to stay on the level even if something needs to be cleaned up a little bit. If there's only one or two issues and it's just an acute issue, meaning it's not a long-term reason or problem for why they can't do the movement pattern, and it's just maybe tight ankles that day, or they're just losing an extension because they're tight or weak, or for whatever, it's short-term acute issues why you would sidestep, which is another thing we'll call lateralization, instead of moving from maybe the deadlift down to the hex bar deadlift if you don't have to. You want your athlete to be where as close as possible as to what you programmed for that day. So the lateralization allows you to maintain what your original prescription was. So looking at just real quick example before we dive in, the deadlift. So if we have one of these two problems, loss of extension, meaning our back kind of rounds out, we'll move them over to blocks and see if that cleans it up. And then if there's an anterior shift where the knees are shifting forward, that also is usually cleaned up by blocks. So moving right along, if we look here, this is the conventional deadlift. This is how we want to see it. Vertical shin, no loss of extension, no anterior shift of the knees. But if we look here, this is an example of what it looks like to have lost the extension. See that round in the lower back? That is not what we want to see. And then our way to clean that up would be to sidestep or lateralize and then move this from the blocks. So that cleans everything up. This could just be a really tight hamstring issue for the day. This isn't where you want to be long term. And then if you see here, we're not keeping that straight bar path. Our knees are shifting forward. This is called an anterior shift. This could also be muscle tightness. And then usually that can be cleaned up from blocks, but if you're still having it from blocks, then you're going to downgrade or regress into our hex bar. So the hex bar deadlift, you can get away with a little bit more anterior shift, and the handles are up a few inches higher, so this also is kind of like you're giving your athlete a lift, and they just don't have to worry about the pattern as much, but you still want to make sure it's a hip dominant hip hinge exercise. So if you're having any issues here with anterior shift or loss of extension, you're going to again move this to a box. And then if you're having any valgus, which is the knees coming in the middle, you can throw a band around the knees to give that external cue to push the knees out. Or if that does not work, you can move to a double dumbbell deadlift or a double kettlebell deadlift. I prefer the dumbbells because they are a little bit more narrow and they don't have that big kettlebell head on it to where it kind of pushes your knees and you don't have to worry about it. So if you look here, this is an example of a dumbbell deadlift. So you wouldn't have your client pick it up off the floor if they're having extension issues. You just kind of scale it to about mid-shin. Then if you're having knee valgus issues like this is horrible to watch, right? The easiest way to clean this up is to transfer them right over to the kettlebell deadlift. So this isn't a sidestep, this is actually a regression. The sidestep on the double kettlebell deadlift would be loss of extension and then just going to a higher level. And see how that cleans up the knee valgus? If you're losing extension on a kettlebell deadlift, you're going to take it from a higher height on a box. So this happens if you have really tight hamstrings, Or if you're really tall, just your anthropometrics are different than most people's, so you might just have to go from a few inches up. The next step down is the PVC hinge. So this is for people that are really not getting the hip hinge movement. You don't want to load them until they understand this movement. So this is our very bottom level, which is probably where you should start people with before you even load them. Like if it's a new client, you want to have them do this. If it's an athlete, you can kind of assume they've probably moved before in a hip hinge pattern. If they're not getting it, quickly regress them to this PVC pipe hinge. So you'll take this PVC pipe, put it at your head, between your shoulder blades, and at your tailbone. So make sure that you have 3 points of contact all the way throughout the hinge. Make sure that your head's not coming up where you're losing contact between your shoulder blades, or it's not coming up off of your tailbone. If this is still an issue for your client or your athlete, which you'd be surprised how often people can't do this, then your lateralization for the PVC pipe hinge is going to be the kneeling hinge. So this is really easy. This should clean up every issue that you have. You have your athlete put their hands over their head and then just sit their butt back to their heels. This kind of takes out that lower limb part where you only have to worry about the hip. It takes out one more hinge area of the knee, so you don't have to worry about it as much, and it's just a lot cleaner, more concise, and less for your client or athlete to have to focus on. So that's pretty much the bottom of the totem pole hip hinge. So if you have somebody new that you're not sure how they move and you want to start them at the bottom and move them all the way up, that's totally fine. And sometimes it's better to do that, because if you start at too high of a level and then you have to either lateralize or regress all the way down, it's a little demoralizing. So try to assess how your client moves a little bit, just walking, doing some screening and testing before you even move them into this for the prescription. All right, so back to our graph. This should all make a lot more sense now that you've seen all of the exercises. So think about this as level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, or you can flip that if you want level 5 to be the hardest. The conventional deadlift, that is going to be the exercise where we can move the most weight on a hip hinge. I mean, you could argue for sumo deadlift, but that's not a good athletic position to put people in. Unless you're doing powerlifting, then that's more geared towards their sports. But for athletes in general, it just doesn't transfer as much to have them externally rotated like that. So we'll just pretend, for the sake of your athletes in this lecture, that the conventional deadlift is the top tier. So if you sidestep to the right, if your athlete is having issues with extension or they're having some forward anterior shift, then your sidestep, your lateralization, is from blocks. The point of the lateralization is to allow you to still work with the barbell and do the conventional deadlift, but clean up those patterns without fully dropping down to the next level, like a full regression. I would still consider it a modification, but you don't have to fully call it a regression. And then the hex bar deadlift, if you have any anterior shift or valgus, you can either clean up the shift with the blocks or the valgus with the band around the knees for some external cueing. If it's still not looking good at that point, then you're going to move your athlete to the double dumbbell deadlift and then have them pretty much move it around mid-shin. You don't want to have them do the dumbbells all the way from the floor, because if you think about how you would have somebody do a conventional deadlift with the plates, they're already probably 6 to 12 inches off the floor there. So you don't want the dumbbell heads going all the way to the floor. And then if they lose extension there, you can have them go to side blocks just so they have a goal to meet. Then down the next step, kettlebell deadlift. So that goes right in between your feet, just one kettlebell. If you're losing extension, you're going to scale up and just shorten the range of motion and do it from a box. PVC pipe hinge is that lower level where you have the PVC pipe on the back of your head between your shoulder blades and your tailbone. And then the lateralization for that is not understanding or just really not connecting to the PVC hinge. So the kneeling hinge is going to be that one. Also keep in mind that just because you have programmed hex bar deadlift doesn't mean that your athletes can't do the conventional deadlift. So whatever level you're on, there's specific goals to do, maybe like the hex bar deadlift instead of the conventional deadlift. Maybe you've got a team of 15 athletes and it's just easier to coach and not worry about any slight anterior shift. So you'll throw your athletes on the hex bar, and that's totally fine. So just because you have somebody at a certain level doesn't mean they can't do the level up. But just keep in mind, whatever level you're at, if you see any of those acute issues, then you'll sidestep to lateralize without having to fully drop down. Another thing to think about too is if your athlete can't do a solid kettlebell deadlift or dumbbell deadlifts, then is there really a need to move all the way up to the barbell if it doesn't need to be loaded that much? It depends what the goal is. So if you want to get them used to deadlifting with a conventional barbell and they can do it at a really light weight, there's no problem with that. But there's also good arguments for mixing up the grip and just mixing up slight positioning with each of these deadlifts, even though all of them are still considered lower body pull, hip dominant movements.